And this is James Francis. James is an artist, the tribal historian for the Penobscot Nation. He has done a lot of work in a lot of different ways. He's a photographer, and he has done work with anti-racism, particularly for the Wabanaki people, and his name is in lots of places. And he drove down this morning from Old Town, and they're driving back this afternoon. So we are very honored to welcome James and Jennifer. And I think with that, I'll turn it over to you, James.
Thank you, Linda. Just a point of note, my wife drove. Any chance I can get, she can drive me. And thank you, Suzanne, for the invite. And I am going to just jump right into a presentation called Sense of Place. When are you going to come down? When are you going to land? I should have stayed on the farm. I should have listened to my old man. I see some of you nodding. You recognize those lyrics? It's an Elton John song, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. Do you ever have one of those songs that when you hear it on the radio, it transports you back in time to a place or to that person, or, there's a variety of things that take place. For me, that song transports me all the way back to when I was about 3 or 4 years old. And I actually see a scene when that song starts. I see the skyline of Boston at night as we were crossing Tobin Bridge. And I can see my mother's lips singing, you can't hold me forever. Another line in the song. So I was born in New Britain, Connecticut, started my life in southern New England, and at some point my mother left my father. And she packed up my older brother and my younger sister and myself into a little tiny panel moving van, and we headed north. And as we were crossing Tobin Bridge, that song came on the radio, and she turned it up, and it burned into my brain. What's really cool about this song, and I don't own it, I've never downloaded it, I never bought the CD, is I let it come to me as it comes to me, because it really signifies the first time that I ever went home. This is the first time I ever went to Indian Island, the place where I would grow up and where I work today. What's ironic about this story is that little panel truck, the little panel van that my mother packed us up in, was actually a Mayflower moving van. And so going to a reservation in the Mayflower, there's something not quite right about that. So I grew up on the Penobscot Indian Reservation, which is just adjacent to Old Town. The reservation's actually 220 some odd islands in the river. We occupy the southernmost island, an island we call Indian Island. In the language, we would call it El Nabe Manahan, and that means the People's Island. And it's right above the falls, the place where the river widens out, or the place of the White Rocks. And this is where we get the term Penobscot from, a description of the falls just below where the reservation is. Happens to be a dam there today, but that's where we live. So used to kick around the island quite a bit. The great thing about growing up on Indian Island was My mother never told me, don't leave the yard. I could leave the yard. She never told me, don't leave the street. I could leave the street. All she ever told me was, don't go over town, which meant don't cross the bridge to Old Town. And we always called it Overtown. So we spent a lot of time on the river, in canoes, paddling around growing up. I remember one day I was kicking around with my friend Kirk, who's now our tribal chief. We're the same age. And there was a house down over the hill by the pond. And affixed to this house was a sign. Well, there was a piece of plywood, and spray painted on this plywood was the term Wounded Knee. And this is the late 70s. And so we went down over the hill, knocked on the door. Kirk took off, left me standing there for a very curt elder say, what do you want? And I was like, so I mustered up the courage to spit it out and asked her about what the sign meant. Oh, come in, come in. I got some lemonade and cookies and a story. And I was 10 years old, and that is one of those things I can point to today and say that's when I started my journey at being a historian. And I spent some time with her, time and again. She'd invite me over to hear more stories. She recognized that I had an interest there. So I grew up, went to Old Town High School under the Indians, ablazoned across my tracksuit. And after high school, I joined the Air Force and got transplanted to Cheyenne, Wyoming. Has anybody ever been to Cheyenne, Wyoming? It's an alien landscape compared to here. Quite different. I mean, the town itself is 6,000 plus miles above sea level, which is higher than any point here in Maine. What they call the high plains, kind of rolling plains. It's not super flat, but you can see, good 50 miles away. My first wife, who I married very young, she's from there, and she came to Maine and actually felt claustrophobic here because of all the trees. There you can see 50 miles. Here you can barely see out of the yard. So just a big difference. So when I divorced the Air Force, my first wife divorced me. She wasn't interested in coming back to Maine. I was not interested in staying there. So I started college at the University of Maine, wanted to study history, and I was taking some Native American studies classes, actually learning about the Trail of Tears, the forcible removal of the Cherokee Nation from their homeland to some alien landscape. And I was thinking about my time in Cheyenne and how different, and I had a lot of admiration for the Cherokee because they're still here today and they're quite numerous. How did they survive in that place? How did they know where fresh water was? How did they know those particular red berries were edible? Back in their homeland, they had generations upon generation upon generations of knowledge of plants, animals, the landscape. As I was thinking about this, walking across the campus of the University of Maine, I was heading up on Hilltop, and there's a lot of pine trees there, and I realized that, wait a minute, my tribe has never been forcibly removed. This pine tree is a descendant of the same pine trees that my ancestors dealt with. And it changed my life. It changed how I saw the world. It changed what I studied. It changed how I studied. And I walked back down over the hill, went and saw my advisor, and took everything I could that had anything to do with this landscape, Maine, and began my journey. So I've read a lot of cultural geography things because that's essentially, history is not what I'm engaged in when I do this. It's cultural geography. And there was a Chinese cultural geographer named Yifu Tuan. And Yifu Tuan formulated that a space, an area, plus culture equals place. So space plus culture equals place. So you need that human element, that cultural element to get a sense of place, or otherwise it's just space, an area. I recognize this as a formula in that I could manipulate it. If we put American culture in the desert, it's going to be seen, that desert's going to be seen differently than a desert culture. Same thing with culture. That say we take the Penobscot River Valley and we think about it today from today's cultural standpoint. You're going to talk about logging history. You're going to talk about Bangor being the lumber capital of the world. You might throw Henry David Thoreau in there. And even more recently, you might talk about the river restoration and dam removal and cleanup and all of that. But that's from a Maine, American, Western-centric cultural viewpoint. What if we took that culture and plugged in Penobscot culture? How would we see that same space differently? How would we end up with what type of place would we see? And so this is essentially what I've been working on for many years. Katahdin. Anybody know what that word means, Katahdin?
Great mountain? Something like great mountain?
Great mountain. Does that make sense? Yeah, why does it make sense?
The only?
Huh?
The only? Oh. I'm trying to remember a movie that I saw.
Ah.
I can't remember what the guy said.
But how many agree that Great Mountain makes sense? Yeah, why?
It's the biggest
It's the biggest, like where?
in Maine.
In Maine. Okay, so if we think about our little formula that I just did, space plus culture equals place, we're mixing cultures when you say that. Because when Katahdin was named as greatest mountain, there was no Maine, first of all. Second of all, just across the border in New Hampshire is Mount Washington, which is bigger. But I ask you, if you were an indigenous person walking or canoeing around and you see Mount Washington one day and then a few days later you see another mountain, maybe Katahdin, how would you even know which one was bigger, first of all? So my point is that people often go right towards, yeah, that makes sense, it's the biggest in Maine. And it's irrelevant because greatest mountain was named before Maine, and we're mixing apples and oranges here. And greatest mountain actually comes from, well, we have a lot of stories about Gluskop, and when Gluskop finished his teachings with the people, he got in his canoe and he paddled north, and Katahdin is said to be his lodge. And he and his family are in there making arrowheads for a war that has yet to be fought. So that has a lot to do with this idea of greatest mountain, but I'm not positive. All I know is when I'm standing there looking at Katahdin, it's something that you feel. There's something is going on there, that there's some sort of greatness there. So Gluskop got in his canoe. So the new piece of art, which is over there, features making of birch bark canoes. And it's a combination of historic photographs and also modern photographs, because it's something that we continue as a tradition today. And there's also a poster on there of a local Penobscot man who made canoes locally, and I'll get into him a little bit more later. But I wanted just to touch on the importance of birch bark canoes for our culture. So on pretty much all the rivers that feed into the Gulf of Maine, including the Saco, all the major ones, the Royal, the Androscoggin, Kennebec, Penobscot, all the way down the line. There lived native peoples that lived a riverine culture and very seasonally migratory existence. Not like nomadic where like they're trudging through the woods and, oh, a berry bush we eat today. It was very sophisticated understanding of knowing where that berry bush was, when those berries would be ripe, and knowing the best way to get there. But the basic model of seasonal movement would be summers on the coast, because why not? It's beautiful. No, but summers on the coast in large numbers. So say this whole room was a tribe. We could live all together on the coast in the summertime because there was enough shellfish to feed us all. However, when the leaves start to change and fall starts to creep in, we would have to, me and my family, would have to go into our birch bark canoes and paddle inland. And we may paddle 100 miles to a place where we go every year in the fall. A place where I know where the best hunting parts are. The place where Jennifer knows where the best berries are and nuts to gather. And we would do that in the fall. Start gathering provisions and getting ready to winter over in that same place. People scattered. This family may be just going upriver a little ways. Another family may be going all the way up and then portaging into Moosehead Lake and wintering over there. So there was this, the carrying capacity of the land meant that we had to spread out. And that spreading out required birch bark canoes. You see there's at least two of them in this picture. And I really wanted to show in this picture that people actually used the birch bark canoe. If you were out traveling by yourself, you could sleep under your canoe. It became your shelter. There's a great picture of a guy named Joe Mell. I think National Geographic took it many years ago, and he's actually asleep under his canoe, and the whole picture is lit by the fire. It's just, I just love that picture. So there's a big importance of canoes, and in fact, it's birch bark canoes that ties this image to the image I brought today. So place names, place nomenclature, Penobscot place names. We find that we get some information from them. We see that because we did so much traveling on waterways by way of canoes, a lot of these place names are road signs. They're physical descriptions of what you see from the river, usually from an upriver perspective. And what's interesting, like there's a major portage route, Sowadabscook to the Sebasticook. And the Sowadabscook, if you paddle all the way to the headwaters of that, about a half-mile portage into Pleasant Pond, and then once you're in Pleasant Pond, you're actually at the top of the Sebasticook. So Sowadabscook to the Sebasticook. And the Sebasticook, if you take that all the way down, you're actually in the Kennebec. So what you've done in a half mile It's a 90-mile paddle because it's very windy. But you jump from one river system to the next. But Sawadamskook means at the sloping ledge. And if you're paddling north or upstream in the Penobscot, you're going to come to this place was a very prominent feature. This sloping ledge. It goes right into the river, and it's a very dominant feature. Pemjadjawuk, which is the falls in Bangor. It was actually the falls that kept navigation to go any further. So they could bring boats to Bangor. But this means, Pemjadjawuk means where the river comes tumbling down. So Bangor is tidal. So at high tide, there's no falls. But as that water recedes, then you start to see this. You start to see this tumbling down of the water get revealed. So it's about those physical descriptions and what is going on in the landscape that we see. Sometimes it's resource-based. Names like Hemlock Island or Birch Stream. Sometimes we see place names that I call that are there in spirit. Like a regular place name, Passadumkeag, that's an anglicized version of our term, which is Bassadumkik. So that's just anglicized version of our word, Mattawamkeag. Mattawamkeag. It's the same, just anglicized. But sometimes place names are there in spirit. For instance, there's a back channel off the Penobscot that they call the Stillwater. That comes from our term, which meant still water. You had to make a decision in the river at some point, and it's either try to climb up a bunch of falls, or you take a left-hand turn in Orono, and you could actually take the flat water route that'll take you to the same place above all those falls on the other side of this island, Big Island. But that is an old name that we gave it. It's just the meaning of the name. So it's kind of there in Blue Hill. There's a town called Blue Hill, and it's named for a hill that's nearby that from the bay is blue. We used to call that Blue Hill. So sometimes place names appear what I call in spirit. Attached to resource base, sometimes it's land use. So I told you that just below Indian Island is this set of falls, and this is one of the best fisheries on the river. Great place there was 17 islands in this little space between what is now French Island and Indian Island. 17 small little islands. They're all either exposed completely because they're below the dam or underwater because they're under the impoundment. But great place to go fishing, put nets, set up weirs, and just above Indian Island is this small island that we call Gut Island today. So it's a place name that's there in spirit because that's where we would take all our catch from the falls. We'd take it to that one little island and we would gut them. Putting the guts on the ground and just taking our food and leaving, and all the critters, the raccoons and all the other critters would deal with that and not be messing with the village. Sometimes there are places that are called the place where we tanned hides, or Bassagasawakeg, which is a river in Belfast, which means where we speared sturgeon by torchlight. So it's very specific resource and a very specific way to get that resource. Tells you a lot about what's going on. And then we have we have place names that are attached to our oral history, our oral traditions. We have this one. And I really like this story because it's geolocated. We know where this story took place. It's a story of the Mecum West. They're having fun and they're sliding down these rocks in a stream, and at a place called Nesawatahunk. Nesawatahunk Stream, if you've ever been to Baxter State Park and you've hiked into Niagara Falls or Little Niagara, they're on the Nesawatahunk Stream. Nesawatahunk means the stream that flows between the mountains. And it flows between Double Top and Katahdin. There's a little rift between these mountains, and Nesawatahunk comes tumbling down through the landscape there. And a heavily igneous landscape in that there's a lot of granite. And the stream just flows over the granite, and over time has polished it smooth, the water. And you can actually slide down the stream in places. And that's what the Mecum West, the little people, we have little beings that live in the forest. They're little curious, magical creatures. And they were playing on the rocks, and nearby, a couple of Penobscots got a sharpened stick, and they're trying to spear salmon, big salmon. And every time they try to pull that fish in, they lose the fish, and the fish swims off with a puncture wound in the side. So the Mecum West came over and they showed us how to make a fishing spear that would kind of open up and grab the fish after you speared it. It's called the leaster. I think there is one in this picture. It's leaning up against the canoe. But what's amazing about this story is not I wasn't surprised that the little people taught us technology, because there's a few legends that happen that way, that they're teaching us how to do something, some sort of technology. But what amazes me about this is that those two Penobscots were fishing for salmon, in a place today where there hasn't been salmon in a long time because of dams. And I think there is like 4 dams, and they just took out 2, but there are 4 dams that keep salmon from getting to that place today. So, and just down from that is funny, because there's this place called Salmon Stream, and it's like right near Medway. And I was reading an article about it one day from 1983, and the author said, "But the name is a misnomer. There's no salmon here." And I was like, well, it's probably there in spirit. It's probably what the native people called it, because, and I even called like a fish biologist and said, hey, what about this stream? Would this be a good stream for like salmon to spawn? He's like, it's perfect. But there aren't any there because, again, just a half-mile downriver is like the biggest dam, one of the biggest dams in the Penobscot watershed. So the second legend involves Gluskop teaching people how to hunt moose. So Gluskop takes the hunting party out in the woods, and they come upon a really big lake, and there they see a cow moose and her calf come out to the shore. So Gluskop bends down, he picks up a sharp stone, he affixes it to a stick, notches that in a bow, pulls back, and he shoots, killing the cow moose dead. Now as the party approached this huge moose, they realize once they get there that she has turned to stone. Yeah, it's quite a fantastic story. But she doesn't turn into just any stone. She turned into that stone that Gluskop picked up off the ground and affixed to a stick. And this is the reason, this is why the story exists, is because that mountain that she became, which we call Canoe today, and Henry David Thoreau writes, you know, as they were paddling at Moosehead Lake, he said that this mountain that rises dark before us, my guide tells me anciently was a cow moose. And so what the story is telling you is this is where you get the resource to kill the moose, that rhyolite and felsite, that was a quarry for those stones at that place. And then later there's this whole other part of the story where they go to Penobscot Bay and he kills the calf, and there's liver down there, and there's all these other things. But what about this area? What about this place? So Linda asked me to do two things. She asked me to do some artwork for an exhibit in the visitor center, and she wanted it to be relevant to this place, and it's right down my alley. So I came here and I spent a day here taking photographs and really kind of getting a sense of this place. I'm not from here. And what I came up with on my visit was this picture here. These red pines, and the estuary down there really lends itself to a temporary encampment. I don't think there was a permanent village here at all. But because, as I was saying, this migratory movement, seasonal movements, there were times where people would come to a place like this, set up camp for a few days while they harvest a specific resource. In this case, sweetgrass. You can see the sweetgrass hanging on the line. I'm all too familiar with this. In fact, the only thing missing from this picture is cats, house cats trying to get up at the sweetgrass as it's hanging, because my wife gathers sweetgrass and she hangs it in the house, and our cats like go nuts. They really, it's like catnip or something, but they're pretty aggressive. She was trying to weave a basket the other day and putting a sweetgrass kind of, what do you call it, binder on the top. And the cats were just after her the whole time. Not just because this grass was flying over, but it was because it was the grass. So that's where this came from. It's meant to be a very temporary camp, but it is this place. It is from a picture that I took here, so it's relevant to here. But it is a probable piece. So the second piece, I'm going to bring it up here. So this is all about making birch bark canoes and paddling birch bark canoes. And it seems like a little hodgepodge of images. But it was all inspired by this, which says Joe Ranko, which was an advertisement, a historic advertisement. And it says, expert guide and canoe builder, Joe Ranko. Canoes built to order for sale or let. Indian guide furnishing parties. Manufactory and wharf at Cape Arundel near Indian Point, Kennebunkport, Maine. I know Joe. Joe Ranko's actually in my family. But why I chose to do this image, that it was inspired by that poster, that advertisement, because it does a couple of things. One, this image has got some blueprints on how to make a birch bark canoe. It's got images of people both historically, and one was taken just about 10 years ago as we had a birch bark canoe making class in the community. One of the images is of me paddling a birch bark canoe. Another one is of my wife paddling. So it's something that is still relevant in our community today, but also very historic. So I wanted it to be like a little bulletin board of a canoe maker. That's why it's kind of a hodgepodge of different imagery. But also, Joe Ranko occupied a space and a time here in the Wells area after colonization, where Native Americans were pushed out and had migrated north. When he was here, there weren't very many Native Americans living locally, and he was asserting a traditional craft here. Talk about the seasonal kind of movements earlier. Well, over time, that seasonal movement changes. We still do it, but what it looks like later on, especially Victorian era, is all winter on the reservation, women making baskets in basket circles. There's images of baskets like stacked up behind them, and like 3 women sitting there weaving together, talking and gossiping, I'm sure. Can't hear that in the picture, but I know they were. Because I've seen it. When her and her friends come to our house to weave baskets, it's something I just go out into my man cave and. But they would take all those baskets and make them all winter, and then they would show up places like Bar Harbor or Poland Springs. That's where Louis Sockalexis, the famous baseball player, got his baseball start, because his mom went there to sell baskets, or Kineo on Moosehead Lake, or even into New Hampshire in the White Mountains with these grand hotels. So they would travel seasonally to these places, and the kids would perform, sing and dance, dress up, perform Native American stuff, and the women would sell their baskets. And in this case, Emma Nicola Ranko came here to sell her baskets, and her husband came with her, and he decided he was going to make canoes locally and give rides and offer his guide service. And so they spent summer after summer after summer. Now, Joe's wife, Emma Nicola, she was one of what I call the 3 sisters. So there was Emma was the oldest, Lucy Nicola Pula was the middle daughter, and the youngest was Florence Nicola Shea. So the youngest, Florence, her son, Charles Norman Shea, now lives in France again. He stormed the beach at Normandy. He was first wave, still sun just barely lighting the beach as he stormed the beach as a medic, earned a Silver Star. This year, he was the only person from the United States to be at the D-Day ceremonies, because he was already there. Because of COVID restrictions, not a lot of people were there. And it is assumed, that he is the remaining Native American still alive that stormed the beach at Normandy. Has received the Legion of Honor. So that's Charles, and this is, so this would be Charles's uncle, Joe Ranko, his Aunt Emma's husband. Lucy married Bruce Poolaw. He was a Kiowa Indian from out west. And during the 1920s, Lucy was actually an agent for Indian talent, and she had grown up in the Chautauqua circuit, going from camp to camp to camp, performing, singing and performing. And when she got a little older, she became an agent for Indian acts in 1920s New York City, and she met this young Kiowa man, younger than her by I think 20 years or so. And when the stock market crashed, she went home to Indian Island and he followed. And they were a big part of establishing pageantry and performance in the community. And their motto was to get people to cross the river, then we can sell them our baskets. We could sell them our moccasins. And so they used to put on these shows every summer. And we call it the Pula era today because we have Western style headdresses on. Bruce and Lucy used to travel the country collecting regalia and other items, and you see us wearing headdresses that don't belong to our culture. But what's interesting about that time is that just for that one weekend, Penobscot people would dress up and it was okay to be Indian. At a time when racism was rampant and we were relegated to this small island, it was nice to see people come over and see the Indians, I guess. So it was a time which was probably pretty good. Now Emma, she was the oldest sister, and these three sisters were the daughters of a guy named Joseph Nicolar. He wrote a book called Life and Traditions of the Red Man, and it's a book that just got republished a few years ago, and an excellent read. It documents some of our oral traditions. It's very well written. It's very nice. So Joe and Emma had several children. I can't guess the number because they lost some children very young, but their oldest daughter name was Edith. She would later marry canoe builder Henry Mitchell. You can find an article online about canoe builder Henry Mitchell. Someone wrote a piece about him. It's somewhere online. But she married Henry Mitchell. But before that, she was sent off to school. Indian agent, state appointed Indian agent, sent the kids to school. And from here, they would send them to Carlisle, Pennsylvania. So Colonel Henry Pratt, who was a Civil War colonel, he started this school. He was actually in charge of a school in St. Augustine, Florida, where not a school, a prison, where they sent all the Native Americans who, during Civil War, who did crimes. And he was experimenting with those Native Americans in St. Augustine, not like Mengele or anything, not anything bad. He was just trying to see if Native Americans could learn how to read and write. And we can. I wrote some notes down here today, which I'm now reading. But he took this model to Congress and he got them to give him a whole campus in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which was called Carlisle Barracks. And it was an old cavalry base. And so he was given the school. And his motto for the school, the idea was to bring all Native American kids from all over and bring them to this school. And his motto was, kill the Indians, save the man. Not like physically kill them, but if you can kill the Indianness in it, if you can kill the culture, you're going to save these poor wretched souls. This is how he saw it. And it was really, systematic cultural genocide. Emma and Joe's oldest daughter, Edith, went to this school. And when she came home, she had a boy with her, a young man named Evans Phillips. He was from the Mohawk Reservation, upstate New York, called Akwesasne. And Edith brought Evans home, and Evans ended up marrying Edith's younger sister. And there's nothing Indian Island about that at all, I assure you. But Evans Phillips and Edith's sister, her name was Elizabeth Ranko, are actually my grandfather's parents, my mother's father's parents. And so Joe Ranko's actually some sort of great-great-grandfather to me. But there's a long history here with this family, because the youngest, been talking a lot about Edith, the youngest of Joe and Emma's kids was a boy named Leslie. Leslie married, her name was Menini, Menini's daughter named Valentine. Valentine grew up on a remote island in the Penobscot River at a place called Poor Farm. She grew up. And Leslie married Valentine. And with their trips down here in the summer to Kennebunkport and the Wells area, they're the ones who ran the Indian Malkin shop for years. So again, here, that was, Leslie and Valentine. And now, I don't know if June is still running. I know I just saw that June had a birthday. She's in her 90s now. And that's Val and Leslie's daughter, June. So we kind of come full circle here. And, this is the reason why I chose these two pieces. They are tied together by way of the canoe, but they're also tied together by place. And I think that it's, I like them both, and I wish I could keep them. But I took pictures with my phone. Is that, I think I'll be okay. But that's it for my talk. If there's any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer those. How are we doing on time?
Doing fine. We got about 5 minutes or more for questions.
Nice.
James, would you be willing to show us on the map where Katahdin is on there? I think that might be interesting for people.
Yeah, so Katahdin, so here's Moosehead Lake. Katahdin is, let's see, Chesuncook, Rainbow. Katahdin is right here. And what's interesting about Katahdin is that any water that flows off the sacred mountain ends up in the Penobscot River. The East Branch goes to the east and to the north of the river, and the West Branch goes to the south and to the west of the mountain. And I often talk about how that sacred water flowing off that sacred mountain kind of weaves itself through the landscape and surrounds our reservation, because it is the islands within that river. And the Penobscot River is here, and it comes up, and this is where it splits. So Katahdin is here. This is the East Branch as it goes up and gets really close to the Allagash, which is, Allagash River is a tributary of the St. John's, and also gets really close, the East Branch gets really close to the Aroostook River, which is another tributary of the St. John. If you ever seen the state of Maine, at the top there's two bumps. Well, one of those bumps, the one to the east, is actually the St. John River making that shape. But then it dips down into Maine, and my wife's a Maine guide. She just did a trip on the St. John a few weeks ago. Very low water. She really learned how to steer the canoe through all these this graveyard of boulders. But yeah, that St. John, it comes into here. It comes up into here. And all these red lines on here are actually canoe routes. So you can see, if you look closely, there's these little dots in between. Those were the portages. That's where you would pick your canoe up out of the water. The word for canoe in the language is agweden, and it means that which floats lightly. Yes?
Does the river you just described, does that flow north, or does the other one flow south?
It flows south. It flows.
Flow south?
No, not all of them. The Allagash actually flows, and the St. John from here are flowing that way. Penobscot, Kennebec flow south. But the Allagash flow, it seems counter, but that's how it works. I see watersheds, you know, when you think of a watershed, any water that falls within that watershed is going to go down whatever. So when I talk about the Penobscot watershed, any water that falls is then going to come to the ocean by way of the Penobscot River. And I see it as this really strange shaped bowl, because as you get further to the edge of a watershed, you're much higher. Like Webster Stream, which is the highest stream on the East Branch, its elevation is up. It's up, and nearby is the highest pond in the Allagash, which is actually even higher. But they never really mixed. There's always a piece of land between there until logging interest decided to run water through it. And actually, part of the Penobscot watershed today includes part of the Allagash Lakes because of logging interest and the boundary battle. The logging interest didn't want to ship their lumber through Canada. There was big tariffs, and so they made what was called the T-Loss Cut, which is actually fun to canoe these days, but it's man-made. It's funny because it's like class 1, maybe class 2 canoeing, but it's like a class 4 swim because it's so new. That the rocks are really sharp and like jagged, so it hasn't had centuries of water flowing through it to make everything soft and well, less sharp, not soft, but yes.
2 questions. Are there any active archaeological sites in the state? And 2, is there a Native American museum in Maine?
Yes, there. The museums. There are. So there's the Penobscot Nation Museum on Indian Island. There are in the Passamaquoddy communities, both at Zibayak and at Madocmigook, or Pleasant Point in Indian Township. There are museums. There's a museum at the University of Maine called the Hudson Museum in Orono, and then in Bar Harbor there's the Abbey Museum.
And archaeological sites, any active?
What do you define active?
They're looking for artifacts.
Yes, probably the most active ones are the Abbey Museum actually they have classes that you could take to go out and participate in digs. They're usually done in conjunction with the University of Maine, but it's the tribal perspective on archaeological digs is it's in the ground, leave it in the ground. In that, you know, we are actively pursuing NAGPRA cases, which is Native American graves repatriation. So it's about getting funerary and human remains out of museums and back into the ground. So we're currently working on NAGPRA types of cases, but there are some archaeological digs, and sometimes they have to be done. There's one in Blue Hill because they're replacing the bridge at the Reversing Falls in South Blue Hill, but that goes right next to burial ground, and so that's been held up. It got held up for a while they did a cultural assessment and changed the approach for the temporary bridge because it was causing more damage to the burial site, and so they wanted to try to mitigate that as much as possible. So today, this is how it happens. We have what's called a tribal historic preservation officer, so an archaeologist who's on staff by the tribe who takes care of things like that, but also does what are called 106, Section 106 requests. Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act says that any federal money that's being spent to break the ground, so if you're building something, you got to break the ground, you have to consult with the local tribe to ensure that that's not a sensitive site. Chris, his name is Chris, he gets inundated with 106 requests regularly on a, yeah.
We have one more question and then we're going to have to wrap it up.
Okay.
Okay, my question was about building a birch bark canoe. Like, how big pieces of birch bark can you weave together? And then how is the structure, the frame of the canoe?
All right, this is going to answer your question. That's one piece of bark.
One piece of bark?
One piece of bark. Yes. So it takes a tree that is about 46 to 48 inches around and 20 feet or so without a branch, because a branch is a hole once you take the bark off. So it takes quite a piece of bark, and we have taken the bark off of trees, and the trees are still alive. You just can't get bark from them again. It just gets this horrible looking scar on it of blackness. And birch bark canoes are built outside in, so you start with the outside, the bark, and that bark, it's orange colored because that's the inside of the bark. It's not the white part of the birch. That's actually, if you ever see a birch bark canoe, you can look under the gunnels and you can see the white with the black lines underneath there, but that's on the inside. You start with the outside of the canoe and then you work in. The last thing that gets done is to put the ribs in, and that's what these gentlemen in the top center are doing. They're actually tapping all the ribs in, and it's kind of a symphony in that they all kind of got to go in together. They're all tapped into place, and they're not attached. They're like wedged into place. The mathematics of making a canoe is so precise. You just put them in place, and it actually causes rigidity for the boat.
Well, thank you very much.